It struck Dion O'Banion as almost funny that after 20 years of running the North Side like his own personal kingdom, bootlegging, hijacking, fixing elections, bribing cops, the thing that would finally get him killed was a handshake. But that's exactly what happened. At 12 o'clock noon on November 10, 1924, three men walked into Schofield's flower shop at 738 North State Street, and when the one called Frankie Yale grabbed O'Banion's hand in a tight grip, the other two pulled pistols and pumped 5 bullets into his chest, neck, and jaw. The florist who sold chrysanthemums to mob funerals was getting the biggest funeral Chicago had ever seen. Because of that handshake, 100 men would die over the next 5 years. Because of that handshake, Chicago turned into an abattoir where Thompson submachine guns became standard equipment and murder became municipal policy. I was born in Little Sicily. Dion O'Banion told people when they asked, which wasn't exactly true. He was born in Maroa, Illinois, in 1892, son of an Irish plasterer, but facts never got in the way of Dion's stories. What mattered was this. By the time he was 20, he was running 3 things: a singing trio at McGovern Saloon, a burglary ring on the North Side, and a protection racket for newspaper circulation. The singing trio was legitimate. The rest was how you stayed alive. When Johnny Torrio and Big Jim Colosimo started organizing Chicago underworld in 1920, they offered O'Banion a piece, the North Side territory, everything above Madison Street. O'Banion took it. Why wouldn't he? He was already taking it anyway. Only now he didn't have to fight the Italians for it. Here's what people didn't understand about Dion O'Banion. He was completely fucking insane, but in a way that made him lovable to civilians. He went to Mass every Sunday at Holy Name Cathedral. He kept his flower shop open for legitimate business. Politicians, funerals, weddings, all the regular trade. He'd personally deliver bouquets to North Side housewives and refused to take payment. But between the flower deliveries, he was hijacking Torrio's beer shipments, muscling in on Sicilian gambling rackets in Little Italy, and ordering executions like he was ordering carnations. The man had no governor between impulse and action. Torrio understood this. Capone didn't yet. That would become the problem. The Prohibition thing changed everything. On January 17, 1920, the Volstead Act went into effect, and suddenly every barrel of beer, every bottle of whiskey, every case of gin became contraband worth its weight in cash. A barrel of beer cost $4 to produce in a basement brewery and sold for $55 to a speakeasy. The profit margins were so obscene you'd have to be an idiot or a corpse not to get involved. Torrio wasn't an idiot. Neither was Dion O'Banion. They carved up Chicago like a Christmas turkey. Torrio and his protege Capone got the South Side and the western suburbs. O'Banion kept the North Side, and everybody made money. For 4 years this arrangement held. For years of relative peace, where the only people getting killed were the occasional hijacker or the independent operator who didn't understand how territories worked. Then O'Banion made his mistake. It wasn't the first mistake. He'd been making small mistakes for years, chipping away at Torrio's patience like water on limestone. He hijacked a Torrio beer shipment in January 1924. He killed 3 Sicilian alcohol cookers who worked for the Genna brothers in March. He refused to attend the sit-down Torrio called to settle the disputes. But the big mistake, the one that got him killed, was the Zeben Brewery deal. On May 19, 1924, O'Banion called Torrio and said he wanted out of the bootlegging business. He was going to move to Colorado for his health. He'd sell his half of the Zeben Brewery operation for $500,000. Torrio thought it was a sweetheart deal. It was a trap. See, O'Banion knew the cops were going to raid the Zeben Brewery. He had a source in the police department. Probably more than one source. Probably half the fucking department. So when he sold his share to Torrio and arranged to meet him at the brewery on May 19th to hand over the operation, he was setting Torrio up for a federal prohibition violation. The raid happened right on schedule. Torrio got arrested. O'Banion got arrested too, but he'd already taken Torrio's money and he'd already decided to retire from the brewery business, so the arrest meant nothing to him. For Torrio, It meant a federal indictment, a trial, and eventually 9 months in Lake County Jail. More importantly, it meant loss of face. You don't humiliate an Italian mob boss and expect to live. Torrio started making phone calls to Brooklyn, to a man named Frankie Yale, to the 2 Sicilian gunmen everyone called the murder twins, John Scalise and Albert Anselmi. The day O'Banion died started like every other Monday. He opened Schofield's at 7 in the morning. He'd bought the shop from William Schofield 3 years earlier, but kept the name because it sounded legitimate. The location couldn't have been better. Directly across the street from Holy Name Cathedral, where every important funeral in Chicago started. Bishops, aldermen, gangsters, they all came through Schofield's for their flowers. O'Banion was in the back room when the 3 men walked in at noon. One of his employees, William Crutchfield, was trimming chrysanthemum stems. The front doorbell rang. O'Banion came out front, clipping shears in his hand. He recognized Frankie Yale. Maybe he recognized the other 2. It didn't matter. Yale put out his hand, and O'Banion took it. That was the custom. You shook hands. Yale's grip was iron tight. O'Banion couldn't pull free. Scalise and Anselmi drew pistols and opened fire. 2 shots to the chest, 2 shots to the face, 1 shot to the back as O'Banion fell. The clipping shears clattered on the floor. The 3 men walked out and got into a car that was waiting on State Street. William Crutchfield called the police. By the time the cops arrived at 12:07, State Street was empty except for the flower delivery trucks. O'Banion's funeral 4 days later cost $10,000 and drew 10,000 mourners, 26 truckloads of flowers, a silver and bronze casket that weighed 2 tons. The funeral procession stretched for a mile. Every politician in Chicago sent flowers. Every cop O'Banion had ever bribed showed up to pay respects. Torrio sent a basket of roses that cost $2,000. Hymie Weiss, O'Banion's second in command, made a note of who sent flowers and who didn't. He was already planning the response. Because here's what Torrio and Capone didn't understand about the North Side gang. They weren't Italians. They were Irish, Polish, and German. They didn't respect the Italian rules about vendettas and sit-downs and bosses. They believed in one thing. If you kill one of ours, we kill all of yours. Starting immediately, 2 months after O'Banion's murder, on January 12, 1925, Al Capone was driving to the South Side his brand new Cadillac sedan when another car pulled alongside and opened fire with shotguns. Capone ducked. His chauffeur, Sylvester Barton, took the wheel and floored it. The attacker's car gave chase for 12 blocks before breaking off. Capone was unhurt but rattled. He'd never been shot at before, not directly, not in daylight, not in a moving car. The rules were changing. 12 days later, on January 24th, the rules change again. Johnny Torrio had just returned from a shopping trip with his wife Anna. They were carrying packages, dress goods from Marshall Fields, a hat box, groceries. It was 4:30 in the afternoon. They pulled up in front of their apartment building at 7011 Clyde Avenue. Torrio got out first to help Anna with the packages. That's when the car came around the corner. 2 men inside, Hymie Weiss and Bugs Moran, O'Banion's top lieutenants. They opened fire with shotguns and a .45 automatic. Torrio caught buckshot in the chest, arm, abdomen, and groin. He went down. Anna screamed. The 2 gunmen got out of their car and walked over to where Torrio lay bleeding on the sidewalk. Moran put the .45 to Torrio's head for the finishing shot. He pulled the trigger. The gun jammed. Weiss and Moran looked at each other, looked at Anna screaming, looked at the neighbors coming out onto their porches, and got back in her car and drove away. Torrio survived because of a jammed gun and because Jackson Park Hospital was only 4 blocks away. He spent 3 weeks in the hospital with round-the-clock police protection. When he got out, he called Capone to a meeting at the Congress Hotel. He had a simple message. I'm done. It's yours. Take it. Capone was 26 years old when he inherited the Chicago outfit. 26 years old, and he was running a criminal empire that took in $100 million a year from bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and labor racketeering. The organization employed 800 people: drivers, brewers, gunmen, bookkeepers, lawyers, cops, aldermen, judges. Capone moved the headquarters to the Lexington Hotel at 2135 South Michigan Avenue and fortified it like a medieval castle. Steel doors, bulletproof glass, escape tunnels, armed guards in the lobby. He never went anywhere without at least 4 bodyguards. He had his Cadillac armored with inch-thick steel plating and bulletproof windows that weighed 300 pounds each. The car cost $20,000. It was less a vehicle than a rolling tank. Because Capone understood what Torrio had learned the hard way, the North Side gang wasn't going to stop. They weren't going to negotiate. They weren't going to respect boundaries. They were going to keep killing outfit guys until either Capone was dead or they were dead. It was binary. Win or die. The war escalated through 1925 like a fever climbing toward critical. On May 25th, Angelo Genna, the oldest of the 5 Genna brothers who control Little Italy, was driving his roadster to the North Side when 3 cars boxed him in at the corner of Ogden and Hudson. Hymie Weiss, Bugs Moran, and schemer Drutchy opened fire with Thompson submachine guns. The first time Tommy guns were used in Chicago gang warfare. Angelo's car crashed into a lamppost. He died at the hospital 3 hours later. On June 13th, Mike Genna, Angelo's younger brother and the muscle of the family, was driving to the North Side with John Scalise and Albert Anselmi, the same 2 gunmen who'd killed O'Banion. 4 cops in an unmarked car flagged him down for a traffic stop. The 3 men opened fire. They killed 1 cop outright, wounded 2 others, and hit the 4th in the chest, but that cop's badge stopped the bullet. Mike Genna caught a police shotgun blast to the leg that severed his femoral artery. He bled out in the ambulance. Scalise and Anselmi got arrested, but Capone's lawyers let them out on bail 6 months later. By then, Tony Genna, the youngest brother, was also dead, shot to death in a barber chair in July. The Genna brothers' operation collapsed. Capone absorbed what was left of their territory. The North Side gang celebrated. They'd killed 3 of the 5 Gennas in 2 months. They were winning, but Capone wasn't finished. On September 20, 1925, he sent 8 carloads of gunmen to shoot up the North Side gang's headquarters at 910 North State Street, the building that housed Schofield's flower shop. The gunmen fired over 1,000 rounds into the building. Hymie Weiss wasn't there. He was at a restaurant 2 blocks away and heard the shooting, but by the time he arrived, the Capone cars were gone. No one was killed. It was a message. We know where you live. On October 4th, Capone's men ambushed Weiss and Drutchy outside the Standard Oil building on South Michigan Avenue. Weiss took a bullet through his coat collar. Drutchy's hat was shot off his head. Both men returned fire and escaped. On April 27, 1926, Weiss and Drutchy sent 10 cars loaded with gunmen past the Hawthorne and Cicero, Capone's suburban fortress, and opened fire with Thompson guns and shotguns. They shattered every window in the building. They fired over 1,000 rounds. Capone was inside eating lunch. He dove under his table and wasn't hit. 1 civilian, a woman sitting in a nearby restaurant, caught a stray bullet and lost an eye. Capone sent her $5,000 and paid all her medical bills. He couldn't afford to look like he was hurting civilians, not when he was already taking heat from the newspapers and the police department for the gang violence. Hymie Weiss wasn't deterred. He ramped up the attacks. On August 10, 1926, Weiss's men machine-gunned Capone's car outside the Congress Hotel. Capone wasn't in it. On September 20th, they opened fire on Capone's summer home in Burnham, Illinois, riddling the building with Tommy gun fire. Capone was in the basement and wasn't hit. Capone decided enough was enough. He called a sit-down. He sent intermediaries to Weiss with an offer. Let's end this. Let's divide the territory permanently. Let's stop the killing. Weiss's response was simple. No. He didn't want territory. He didn't want money. He wanted Capone dead. And he wanted the men who killed O'Banion dead. There would be no negotiation. Capone understood. If Weiss would negotiate, Weiss would have to die. On October 11, 1926, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Hymie Weiss was walking across State Street toward his headquarters at 910 North State. He was with 4 other men, his bodyguard Sam Peller, his lawyer William O'Brien, his driver Benny Jacobs, and a Polish immigrant named Patty Murray. Across the street from the headquarters, Capone's men had rented a second-floor room 10 days earlier. 2 gunmen were in the room, one with a Thompson submachine gun, one with a shotgun. They'd been waiting for 10 days, watching the street, waiting for Weiss to come back. At 4:01, they opened fire. The Thompson gun fired 30 rounds in 3 seconds. Weiss took 10 bullets, head, neck, chest, abdomen. He was dead before he hit the pavement. Patty Murray took 5 bullets and died instantly. Sam Peller took 3 bullets but survived. William O'Brien took 4 bullets but survived. Benny Jacobs took 2 bullets but survived. The 2 gunmen in the upstairs room climbed out a back window, walked down the alley, and disappeared into rush hour traffic. The Chicago Tribune ran the headline, "Weiss slain, war truce near." They were wrong about the truce. After Weiss's death, leadership of the North Side gang fell to Bugs Moran, a career criminal who'd been hijacking and bootlegging since he was 17. George Clarence Moran, born in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1893 to Polish and Irish immigrant parents. He picked up the nickname Bugs because people thought he was crazy, volatile, unpredictable, violent. He was all those things, but he was also smart. He knew that direct frontal assaults on Capone weren't working. Capone's headquarters were too well defended. His cars were armored. His bodyguards were professional killers. Moran decided to change tactics. Instead of attacking Capone, he'd attack Capone's income. He'd hijack Capone's liquor shipments. He'd muscle in on Capone's gambling operations. He'd sabotage Capone's breweries. It was economic warfare. Death by 1,000 cuts. For 2 years, 1927 and 1928, the war simmered without major casualties. There were hijackings, beatings, arson attacks, and bombings, but no mass killings. Capone was busy consolidating power. He'd taken over suburban Cicero and installed his own mayor. He'd expanded into labor racketeering, controlling unions for barbers, janitors, construction workers, and teamsters. He'd opened new gambling houses in downtown Chicago with protection of Mayor Big Bill Thompson. Moran was busy, too, running bootleg operations in the North Side and expanding into Canada, bringing whiskey across the border from Windsor to Detroit and then trucking it to Chicago. Both men were making enormous amounts of money, but the hatred didn't diminish. It accumulated, interest compounding on blood debt. In 1928, Capone decided to eliminate Moran permanently. The plan was elaborate and required patience. First, Capone needed an inside man, someone Moran trusted. He found one, a small-time bootlegger named Joey Aiello, who ran beer operations on the North Side and owed Moran money. Capone offered to clear Aiello's debts if Aiello would set up Moran for a hit. Aiello refused. Capone had him killed in October 1928. Next option, Capone's men posed as out-of-town bootleggers looking to sell hijacked whiskey at a discount. They contacted Moran's gang through intermediaries and said they had a shipment of old log cabin whiskey, premium stuff, stolen from a Detroit warehouse, and they'd sell it cheap if Moran could move it fast. The deal was set for the morning of February 14, 1929. The location, the SMC Cartage Company garage at 2122 North Clark Street, a front business Moran used for storing and distributing bootleg alcohol. The time, 10:30 in the morning. Moran agreed. It was too good a deal to pass up. That was the setup. Capone's execution team consisted of at least 4 men, probably 5. 2 were dressed as Chicago police officers, in full uniform. 3 were dressed as civilians. The plan was simple but required precision. The fake cops would walk into the garage with the civilians and order everyone inside to line up against the wall for a routine prohibition raid. Once the North Side guys were disarmed and lined up, the civilians would open fire with Thompson submachine guns. The fake cops would walk out, get in their car, and drive away. Any witnesses would report seeing police officers making an arrest, which would confuse the investigation and buy time for the killers to disappear. It was theater, deadly theater. February 14th, 1929 was a Thursday. It was cold, 18 degrees, and there was snow on the ground. Inside the SMC Cartage garage at 2122 North Clark Street, 7 men were waiting for the whiskey delivery. 6 of them worked for Bugs Moran. Adam Heyer, Moran's bookkeeper and business manager. Albert Weinshank, Moran's speakeasy manager who physically resembled Moran. James Clark, Moran's brother-in-law. Pete Gussenberg, his brother Frank Gussenberg, both enforcers and triggermen, and John May, a mechanic who occasionally did work for Moran. The 7th man was Reinhard Schwimmer, an optometrist who hung around the North Side gang because he thought gangsters were glamorous. None of them were armed except the Gussenberg brothers, and their guns were in their coat pockets. They were expecting a business transaction, not a war. At 10:25, Bugs Moran's car pulled up to the garage. Moran was in the back seat with Willie Marks and Teddy Newberry, 2 of his top men. Before Moran could get out, he saw a car that looked like a police wagon pull up to the garage. He told his driver to keep going. "I'm not getting pinched for prohibition bullshit on Valentine's Day," he said. The driver kept going. Moran went to a nearby coffee shop to wait out the raid. That decision saved his life. Inside the garage, the 7 men heard someone bang on the door and shout police. Adam Heyer opened the door. 2 men in police uniforms walked in, followed by 3 men in civilian clothes. The uniformed cops ordered everyone to line up against the north wall, hands on the wall, no talking. The 7 men complied. This was routine. Every bootlegger in Chicago had been through this before. Cops would shake you down, maybe confiscate some product, maybe write a citation, and then you'd pay off the precinct captain and get back to work. No big deal. The 7 men faced the wall. The 2 uniformed cops stepped aside. The 3 civilians drew Thompson submachine guns and opened fire. The shooting lasted less than a minute. The 3 Tommy guns fired approximately 70 rounds total. All 7 men went down. Frank Gussenberg took 14 bullets and somehow didn't die immediately. The rest were killed instantly. The gunmen dropped their Thompson guns on the floor and walked out of the garage as if being escorted by the uniformed cops, maintaining the illusion for any potential witnesses. They got into the car that was parked outside and drove away. The whole operation, from entry to escape, took less than 3 minutes. A neighbor heard the shooting and called the police. Real police this time. They arrived at 10:40 and found 6 bodies and Frank Gussenberg bleeding out on the concrete floor. The cops called for ambulances. They tried to question Gussenberg. "Who shot you?" they asked. Gussenberg got shot 14 times, said nobody shot me. Those were his only words. He died 3 hours later at Election Brothers Hospital. The 6 other bodies were Adam Heyer, 40 years old, shot 10 times. Albert Weinshank, 35 years old, shot 8 times. James Clark, 42 years old, shot 7 times. Pete Gussenberg, 41 years old, shot 6 times. John May, 35 years old, shot 8 times. Reinhard Schwimmer, 29 years old, shot 9 times. Total dead, 7. Total wounded, 0. It was the most efficient mass murder in Chicago history. The newspapers called it the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The public reaction was immediate and hysterical. Chicago had tolerated gang violence as long as it stayed confined to gangsters killing each other. But the Valentine's Day Massacre was different. It was too brutal, too organized, too much like an execution. The Chicago Tribune ran front-page coverage for a week. The public demanded action. The police department launched the biggest investigation in city history. Over 200 detectives were assigned to the case. The FBI got involved. The mayor promised to crack down on organized crime. Everybody knew Capone ordered it. Nobody could prove it. Capone was in Florida on February 14th, meeting with the Miami district attorney at the exact time of the murders. He had an ironclad alibi. When reporters asked him about the massacre, he said, "I'm a businessman. I don't know anything about that." The investigation went nowhere. But the massacre accomplished Capone's goal. It destroyed the North Side Gang as an effective organization. Moran survived, but his operation was crippled. 6 of his top men were dead. His liquor supply chain was disrupted. His speakeasies were raided by cops who were under pressure to look like they were doing something. Moran went into hiding. He made a statement to the press. "Only Capone kills like that." It was true, but it didn't matter. Capone had won the war. The North Side Gang limped along for another year, but without muscle, without leadership, without the will to fight. Moran eventually fled Chicago and ended up in Ohio, where he was arrested in 1946 for bank robbery. He died in federal prison in Leavenworth in 1957, a forgotten man. Capone's victory was short-lived. The massacre made him too famous, too visible, too notorious to ignore. The federal government launched a tax evasion investigation. In June 1931, Capone was indicted on 22 counts of federal tax evasion. In October 1931, he was convicted and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. He served 7.5 years in Atlanta and Alcatraz. Syphilis destroyed his brain. He was released in 1939, mentally incapacitated, and spent the last 8 years of his life in his Florida mansion, deteriorating into dementia. He died in January 1947 at age 48. He outlived most of his enemies, but didn't outlive his crimes. The war between Capone and the North Side Gang killed at least 100 men between 1924 and 1930. The exact number is unknowable because many bodies were never found, many murders were never reported, and many deaths were attributed to other causes. But here's what's knowable. Angelo Genna, shot to death May 1925. Mike Genna, shot to death June 1925. Tony Genna, shot to death July 1925. Hymie Weiss, shot to death October 1926. Vincent Drucci, shot to death by police April 1927. Frankie Yale, shot to death in Brooklyn July 1928. Murdered on Capone's orders because Yale was hijacking Capone's liquor shipments. 7 men dead on February 14, 1929. Joey Aiello, shot to death October 1930. Dozens more whose names don't make the history books. Drivers, bagmen, enforcers, bookies, brewers, mechanics, civilians who were in the wrong place at the wrong moment. The Prohibition Wars transformed organized crime in America. Before Prohibition, gangsters were small time. Neighborhood bosses, ward heelers, brothel keepers, gamblers. Prohibition created the modern mafia. National organizations, interstate commerce, political corruption on a municipal and state level, gross revenues in the hundreds of millions. Al Capone's organization, at its peak, was making $105 million a year. Johnny Torrio retired to Brooklyn with an estimated fortune of $30 million. Bugs Moran, who lost the war, still made enough money to live comfortably for 2 decades before his bank-robbing conviction. The violence was extraordinary, but the profit was more extraordinary. For every man who died, 10 more lined up to take his place. Because the math was simple. Beer that cost $4 to make sold for $55 on the street. Whiskey that cost $6 in Canada sold for $40 in Chicago. You could make a year's salary in a single week. You could make a lifetime fortune in a single year. All you had to do was stay alive. I talked to a Chicago cop who worked the North Side during those years. This was 1976. He was 83 years old, retired, living in a nursing home in Evanston. He didn't want his name used. He said this: "You couldn't stop it. We'd arrest a guy on Monday, and he'd be out by Tuesday. We'd raid a brewery, and they'd have a new one running by the weekend. We'd confiscate 10 trucks of booze, and they'd bring in 20 more the next week. The money was too big. The politicians were bought. The judges were bought. Half the police department was bought. You did your job. You collected your paycheck. You took your cut, and you tried not to think about it too much. The ones who thought about it too much ended up drinking themselves to death or eating their guns. I saw 3 cops commit suicide between 1926 and 1930. Good cops, honest cops. They couldn't reconcile what they were supposed to do with what they were actually doing. Me, I reconciled it. I took the money. I looked the other way. I lived to be 83. You can judge me if you want, but you weren't there. You didn't see what I saw. What he saw was this: a city at war with itself. A city where Thompson submachine guns were for sale in hardware stores for $200. A city where the police commissioner was on Al Capone's payroll. A city where the mayor ran for re-election on a platform of keeping the speakeasies open. A city where you could get a beer at 3 o'clock in the morning, but you couldn't get a cop to investigate a murder. A city where violence was so routine that the newspaper stopped covering ordinary gang killings and only reported the spectacular ones. The ambushes, the massacres, the car bombings. Chicago in the late 1920s was the most violent city in America. It was also the most profitable, the most corrupt, and the most glamorous. People came from all over the country to see the gangsters, to drink in the speakeasies, to gamble in the backroom casinos, to watch the floor shows where the chorus girls wore nothing but feathers and the comedians joked about bootleggers and politicians as if they were the same thing. Because they were the same thing. The North Side Gang's headquarters at 910 North State Street still stands. It's a different business now. Office space, retail on the ground floor. But the bullet holes are still in the stone facade. Holy Name Cathedral is still across the street. The sidewalk where Hymie Weiss died is still there. If you stand on that sidewalk and look up at the second floor windows across the street, you can see exactly where the shooters set up. Clear line of sight. Nowhere to hide. Weiss walked into a kill zone and didn't know it until the first bullets hit. The garage at 2122 North Clark Street, where the Valentine's Day Massacre happened, was demolished in 1967. The bricks were sold to collectors. The site is now a parking lot. There's a small plaque, but most people walk past it without noticing. History fades. The violence fades. What remains is the legend. And the legend is this: Al Capone fought a 5-year war against the North Side Gang and won. He won by being more ruthless, more organized, more willing to use overwhelming violence. He won by killing Dion O'Banion, Hymie Weiss, and the 7 men in the Clark Street garage. He won by outlasting Bugs Moran. But in winning, he destroyed himself. The violence made him famous, and the fame made him a target. The federal government couldn't ignore him. The public couldn't tolerate him. The press couldn't stop writing about him. He became the most famous criminal in America, and that fame was his death sentence. Not an actual death sentence. He died in bed, not on a sidewalk, but a life sentence. Prison, disease, dementia, irrelevance. He was 48 when he died. He hadn't been relevant in 8 years. The empire he built collapsed within a decade of his imprisonment. The Chicago outfit survived under new leadership, but it was never as powerful, never as violent, never as visible. Prohibition ended in 1933, and the bootlegging profits evaporated. What remained was gambling, prostitution, labor racketeering, traditional mob rackets that generated steady income but not spectacular fortunes. The golden age was over. The survivors scattered. The dead stayed dead. Here's the final accounting. Dion O'Banion, shot to death November 10, 1924. Age 32. Survived by his wife Viola. Buried in Mount Carmel Cemetery. Johnny Torrio, retired to New York after being shot in 1925. Lived to age 75. Died of a heart attack in Brooklyn in April 1957. Never did another day in prison after his Lake County sentence. Al Capone, convicted of tax evasion October 1931. Sentenced to 11 years. Served 7.5. Released November 1939. Died January 1947. Age 48. Buried in Mount Carmel Cemetery, 200 yards from Dion O'Banion. Hymie Weiss, shot to death October 11, 1926. aged 28, buried in Mount Carmel Cemetery. Bugs Moran fled Chicago after the Valentine's Day Massacre, arrested for bank robbery in Ohio in 1946, sentenced to 10 years, transferred to Leavenworth in 1957, died in prison February 1957, age 63, buried in a pauper's grave. Frankie Yale, shot to death in Brooklyn, July 1928, age 35, buried in New York. The 7 victims of Valentine's Day Massacre, Adam Heyer, Albert Weinshank, James Clark, Pete Gussenberg, Frank Gussenberg, John May, Reinhard Schwimmer, all buried in Chicago cemeteries, all dead by age 42. Combined age of the 7 victims, 264 years. Combined time they spent dead, over 600 years and counting. The war was supposed to be about territory, about who controlled the north side and who controlled the south side, about who sold beer to which speakeasies and who paid tribute to which boss. But it wasn't about territory. It was about pride. Dion O'Banion couldn't accept being subordinate. Al Capone couldn't accept being disrespected. Hymie Weiss couldn't accept his boss's death going unavenged. Bugs Moran couldn't accept losing. None of them could walk away because walking away meant admitting defeat, and defeat meant death. If not physical death, then death of reputation, which for a gangster was the same thing. So they kept fighting. They kept killing. They kept escalating until the only possible outcome was total annihilation of one side or the other. Capone's side won, but what they won was a graveyard. I get to live the rest of my life like a schnook. That's what Henry Hill said at the end of Wise Guy, and it applies here too. The guys who survived the Chicago beer wars, the ones who didn't get shot, didn't get imprisoned, didn't get deported, they got to live like schnooks, anonymous, forgotten, working regular jobs, paying taxes, obeying traffic laws. No more free drinks, no more respect, no more walking into a room and watching the place go quiet because everyone knows who you are. That was the real price of survival. Obscurity. The guys who died, O'Banion, Weiss, the Gusenbergs, the other 90, they got funerals with 10,000 mourners. They got front-page obituaries. They got their names in the history books. The survivors got nothing, not even good stories, because the best stories ended in blood. Today, Chicago looks nothing like it did in 1929. The speakeasies are gone. The breweries are gone. The gambling houses are gone. The corruption is still there, different names, different schemes, but the same fundamental transaction, money for protection. The violence is still there too, but it's not gangster violence anymore. It's street violence, drug violence, turf violence. Different product, same war. The Thompson submachine guns are in museums now. The bullet-riddled cars are in storage. The buildings where the murders happened are parking lots or office buildings or luxury condos. The gravestones in Mount Carmel Cemetery are weathered and hard to read. Most visitors don't know who Dion O'Banion was. Some have heard of Al Capone, but only because he's been in movies. The actual history, the 5 years of nonstop bloodshed that turned Chicago into America's murder capital, is forgotten by everyone except historians and crime buffs. But here's what's not forgotten. The lesson. The lesson is that violence escalates. It doesn't de-escalate. It doesn't stabilize. It accelerates until someone wins or everyone dies. O'Banion's murder triggered Torrio's shooting, which triggered Capone's takeover, which triggered the Genna murders, which triggered Weiss's assassination attempts, which triggered the Weiss assassination, which triggered the Valentine's Day Massacre, which triggered federal intervention, which triggered Capone's conviction and imprisonment. Each act of violence justified the next act of violence, and each justification was accepted by both sides until there were no sides left, just corpses and survivors. That's the lesson. That's what the Chicago beer wars teach us. Not that crime doesn't pay. Crime paid spectacularly well for a while, but that violence consumes everything. It consumes your enemies, then your allies, then yourself. Al Capone understood this by the end. When he was in Alcatraz, riddled with syphilis, his mind disintegrating. He told a prison psychiatrist, "I should have walked away. I had enough money. I should have walked away." But he didn't walk away. None of them walked away. And because they didn't walk away, 100 men died, and the ones who survived got to spend the rest of their lives knowing they killed or helped kill those 100 men. And for what? For territory they eventually lost. For money they eventually spent. For respect they eventually forfeited. For a war that nobody actually won. The Chicago beer wars ended the way all wars end. Exhaustion, imprisonment, death. The participants scattered or died. The empire dissolved. The profits evaporated. What remained was memory, and even that faded. But for 5 years between 1924 and 1929, Chicago was the most violent place in America, and the men who made it violent, Capone, O'Banion, Weiss, Moran, Torrio, were the most famous criminals in the world. They defined an era. They created the template for every gangster movie, every mob story, every organized crime narrative that came after. We remember them not because they were good men. They weren't, but because they were spectacular. Spectacularly violent. Spectacularly ruthless. Spectacularly doomed. That's the story. That's the Chicago Blood War. That's what happens when pride matters more than survival, when revenge matters more than profit, when violence becomes the only language anyone speaks. It ends in a garage on Clark Street with 7 bodies lined up against the wall and 70 bullet holes in the bricks. It ends with the winners dying in prison and the losers dying in the street. It ends the only way it could end, badly for everyone.